George Orwell in 1984 said, "He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future." I actually believe that's true.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Midtrack, and this week my guest is Richard S. Tedlow, the MBA Class of 1949 Professor of Business Administration Emeritus at the Harvard Business School, where he's a specialist in the history of business. After spending more than 3 decades at Harvard, Tedlow was recruited by Apple to become a member of Apple University, the company's executive education arm. Tedlow is the author of excellent business history books and biographies. I spend most of this conversation focused on his 1990 book, New and Improved: The Story of Mass Marketing in America. It's an expansive survey of how commerce and marketing evolved from the mid-19th century up to around 35 years ago when the book was published. We also touch on how these trends continued in the 1990s and beyond with the rise of the internet, mobile, and social media. It's an interview packed with ideas and case studies, and Tedlow is a great storyteller. So I'm excited to share this episode. Now, here's my conversation with Richard S. Tedlow. Richard Tedlow, welcome to A History of Marketing.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
I had a lot of fun researching your work, your career, and reading your book, New and Improved. And I'm going to ask you about all of that. But one person I want to ask you about is someone that I heard you mention in an interview. His name was Alfred D. Chandler Jr. Can you tell me, who is Alfred Chandler and what did you learn from him?
Alfred Chandler is basically the man who founded modern business history, and I learned a great deal from him. He's most well known for two critical books. One is called Strategy and Structure, and that was published in 1962. And another is called The Visible Hand, and that was published in 1977. Strategy and Structure was a study showing the relationship between a strategy that a company wants to investigate or pursue and the structure that the company has, the organizational structure that it has. So, for example, if you think about Chapter 2 in Strategy and Structure, that's about the DuPont company. Al's middle name was DuPont, and although he was not a member of the family, he was very close to it, Alfred DuPont Chandler Jr. And Strategy and Structure is the story of a company, DuPont, which grows very big between 1914 and 1919, decides that it wants to pursue a new strategy, which is product diversification, and discovers that the old structure prevents him from doing that. So Strategy and Structure is the story of a crisis that the company experiences in 1919, 1920, 1921, and how that crisis internally leads it to develop a structure which makes the strategy possible. And the structure that makes the strategy possible is a change from what is called the U form, in other words, the unitary form of a corporation, which is, in other words, you've got a manufacturing department, a marketing department, and that's pretty much it, to a multi-divisional form, which is called the M form, which locates the direction of the company around product divisions. So now you have a paint division, which has a manufacturing, a marketing, and a management. And that divisionalization became the structure which permitted the strategy of product diversification to take place. Up until that book, nobody had really intellectualized what it means to try to pursue a strategy with a structure that's holding you back. And nobody made it so clear that structure must serve strategy, not the other way around. So that's one thing I learned from Chandler. When he came to the Harvard Business School in 1970-71, the business history course there was called Business in Its Historical Environment, BAG. And basically, it was a nice course, but it was the basic problem with history, which is it was a bunch of examples and you didn't know what they exemplified. He changed that course. He labeled it The Coming of Managerial Capitalism. So now the course was about the coming of management to business. And as business grew big, what that meant for the laboring person and the development of unionizations, especially during the 1930s, and what it meant for government, the development of government regulation. So it was about business, government, and labor, and that was the course that I taught for many years. But he, in other words, he gave it a fuselage. He gave it a raison d'etre, which really hadn't existed before. And you could take that and build anything off of it. I mean, the tree trunk was so hard, so strong, so vital that all kinds of branches could grow off of it. And that was what I did during the 32 years that I spent at the Harvard Business School.
So it sounds like business history sort of had just been businesses and history in some historical sense, but was less about how do we derive strategies and frameworks from studying business history. And Chandler sort of helped make it more relevant, make it more useful to people by seeing how does this company through its history change its strategy, and what are the lessons for other companies and other contemporary business leaders to take lessons from business history. Is that sort of part of the right way to think about it?
I think so. That's very well put, actually. I think that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does give you a set of questions. And if you attack those questions properly, you're going to come up with the true and righteous way of moving forward. So after reading Strategy and Structure, which, by the way, McKinsey, my recollection is the well-known consulting firm, gave to its managers and its partners, after reading Strategy and Structure, you know that the first question you ask when you're dealing with a company that's got a problem is our structure holding back our strategy? What's the relationship between these? The structure should facilitate it, not screw it up. And he gave as vivid an example of that in real life, using the manuscript resources and he much more so than anybody ever had before. And then with a visible hand, he came up with a master narrative of business history. The classic problem for an historian, which I've been all my life, is history is one damn thing after another. So the question is, so what? Therefore what? And Chandler gave you the therefore what, and that was wonderful.
That's
So
great.
it was liberating and very exciting to be around him.
Was it Chandler as a primary influence that inspired you to become a business historian and spend so much of your career to it? Or what were some of the formative influences that led you to pursue this as part of your career?
My father was a business executive, and when I was getting my master's in graduate school, I thought it'd be interesting to write about a company, which not many people were doing back in 1970, 71. He
Mhm.
said, you ought to take a look at Revlon, which was a big cosmetics company in the 1970s. And the entrepreneur of Revlon, Charles Revson, was still very much alive. And I did. So that was what my MA was about. My first referee journal article publication was in 1976, and it was about Revlon and the quiz show scandals, because Revlon sponsored the $64,000 question. And then after that, moving to public relations and, how does a company present itself to the public? It was a more or less natural progression. And so, no, I decided pretty early on that I wanted to be a business historian. I first met Al in 1973 at a seminar, which I was part of and he presided over. And then when I got to the Harvard Business School, he was already the Strauss Professor of Business History. And I got to work with him very closely. So another lesson, by the way, of working with him, he was working on a gigantic book called Scale and Scope. And he gave me a bunch of chapters to read, and I found a mistake in one. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I was very young and I was not well known in the profession. He was world famous. So how do I go about explaining to Professor Chandler, Al, that this didn't quite work? And so I told him I thought that there was an error here, and he was very quiet. And then we met weekly in those days, and he said, I looked into what you found. You're right. He changed his text, and then he gave me like a gigantic man. He said, go over the whole thing. Anything you find, I want to know about. And that was really the beginning of our working together. Then we wrote a case book together, which was published in 1985 on business history. And it was a wonderful relationship for me. I mean, I learned an immense amount from that man.
Studying business history and researching it at that time must have been so different than how it is today. First off, because just business history in general was even more of a niche area than it is now. And also like pre-internet research as well, or pre-computer assisted research in the same way. It seems like that. I mean, if I was in Chandler, I'd be very grateful to have a smart student being willing to like look over and pore over and fact check my work as well. So that's must have been a fun time to be working in business history?
It was joyful. I mean, we wound up with a very close-knit group of people. And at the Harvard Business School, that's an institution. No one goes to the Harvard Business School to learn history. They don't generate historians. But nevertheless, at one point, we were teaching 1,300 students business history at HBS. And it was our team. I mean, they were just terrific people. It was one for all and all for one. It was
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful professional experience for me.
So I'm going to ask you a little bit about marketing history within business history, because I went to grad school, studied marketing, and most disciplines you have some emphasis on history. Or if I took a geology class or a psychology class or an economics class or any number of classes, I learned some of the history of the discipline, but that never really happened with marketing classes. At most, they'd reference Kotler and the four Ps in the 1960s, and it's like, well, there's
Yes.
no marketing history before that. So why, when it comes to marketing, do you think there's such less emphasis on marketing history? Or why is it that other disciplines will, the first lesson in the course will probably be some survey of the history of it before you get into the modern theories of any topic, but that doesn't really happen so much with marketing? Why do you think that is?
History has to market itself to marketing. You need, as an historian, to explain why this is important for you to know. And I think that the problem is the historians more than the marketers. I mean, we have not been sufficiently accessible to the world of marketing. There is a conference called the Conference of Historical Analysis and Research in Marketing, CHARM.
Yeah, charm.
So it does exist. And you'll also find articles on marketing in the Business History Review, which is edited at Harvard, which I edited in the 1980s. But you're right. I mean, even if you look at strategy, for example, I mean, there's a well-known textbook called The Economics of Strategy. They start off with history. And, I'd like to see more of that in marketing. Maybe it'll happen. Who knows?
When I started this podcast, I was initially looking for a book on marketing history, and I didn't find one. And it was only after I had started this podcast and recorded a few episodes that I came across New and Improved. And it's probably the closest book I found that has the expansive history that I was looking for. So I'm almost grateful I didn't find it at first, because I may have not started this podcast had I just found it and read it. But it's written in this. What I love about it is it's written in this approachable style that's not just for academics. Some of the other marketing history texts or groups or conferences that you reference, they're very academic focused, and this one, it seems like something I could just pick up and read at the beach or something like that, and just enjoy the story but also take the lessons. So was that part of your goal in writing this book, is to write a more sort of popular book, or what were your initial inspirations for writing this book?
I like to write the way I speak. I like it to be almost as if it's spoken. As a matter of fact, one of my books is on Audible. I mean, I spoke it. For Amazon asked me to do that. So I wanted it to be accessible. And another thing I learned from Chandler, by the way, is that your research has to be solid, because your interpretations may be revised by others or reinterpreted, but the research, if it's good, will last forever. So if you look at this book and don't think about the propositions and don't think about the generalizations, but look at the history, you won't find, I don't think, in this compact a form, a history, for example, of Coke and Pepsi or Ford and GM. So yeah, my goal is to make it, and in all my writing, I try to write as if I'm speaking. I try to be accessible. And certainly my teaching was the same way.
It's primarily focused on America and the 20th century, really the late 1800s up to around 1990 when it was published. And why were you focused on this time in America specifically? Was it that a global history through all of history would have been too much to fit into one book? Or did you think this was a particularly special time and place to really share the narrative of marketing story?
Both of those are true. And some of it, frankly, is my own intellectual limitation. I mean, I'm an historian of the United States. I was a history major at Yale. I got my PhD at Columbia in history, but it was American history. And there's a hell of a lot to know just in American history. Those are the archives I've worked in. That's what I know best. So if I'm going to make an academic statement, it's got to be based in America. That's where the intellectual capital exists for me, which isn't to say there isn't plenty to learn from, any number of other countries. It's just I leave that up to somebody else who's more global in their perspective.
So I'm going to ask you more about the book specifically. So it categorizes the story of marketing in America into three phases. There's fragmentation, there's unification, and there's segmentation. And can you broadly share with listeners what these are and what these phases sort of mean?
Yeah, fragmentation is early marketing. It's before the railroads, before the telegraph. It was a world of high margins, very low volume, and restricted market size because you couldn't get anything anywhere. There were no railroads. It was a canal-based world. Unification was made possible by the railroad network and the telegraph network. And the full force of it really wasn't felt until the 1880s. The railroad network was still in its infancy in the 1850s. In the 1860s, there was a civil war. You're not going to have national marketing then. The 1870s, there was a depression. So it was in the 1880s that the great growth of branded merchandise marketed nationally takes place. Coca-Cola was founded in 1886. Procter & Gamble was founded in 1837, but Ivory Soap floated in 1879. Kodak was founded in the 1880s. A wide range of other branded products that lasted for a century were founded once it was possible to reach a national market, and also you had information through the telegraph. So that's the era of unification. This is an era of high volume, low margin, because you're looking for volume, and incorporation of a whole national market. In the automobile industry, this comes a little later because it took a little longer from a technological standpoint to have automobiles. But if you look at, for example, the first decade of the 20th century, there were hundreds of automobile companies in the 1905, 1910, what have you. But the Model T organized the market, that unified the market and incorporated the whole country in it. And then after that, the market became segmented. After it was saturated with the Model T, which was the Model T was basic transportation. It takes you there and it brings you back, was Henry Ford's favorite slogan about the Model T. But Alfred P. Sloan Jr. attacked Ford by coming up with the classic product line, which, by the way, was divisionalized. DuPont owned a controlling stake in General Motors. They brought the divisionalized structure to General Motors in the 1920s. And Sloan came up with what he called the car for every purse and purpose: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. And you sort of would work your way up in that ladder. And so they'd have a lifetime value of a customer. It was very modern in many ways. So that's the world of market segmentation. And you see this in lots of different industries. When a new industry is developed, everybody flows into it. Then there are a couple of leaders who sort of organize the market, and then new entrants attacked by segmentation. So that's fragmentation, unification, segmentation.
You kind of alluded to how you illustrate fragmentation, unification, and segmentation with different case studies. There's the Cola Wars and Coke versus Pepsi, which, by the way, has come up a lot naturally on this podcast. I think it's just such a fascinating way to look at that battle and draw lessons of marketing history. Ford versus General Motors, which you were just speaking about. Then there's also the story of A&P, which was one of the most popular retailers in America, although it's probably not a household name today. And then there's the story of Sears Roebuck as well. And I'll start by asking you more about those first two. There's Coke versus Pepsi, and there's Ford versus GM, and there's sort of this corporate combat narrative approach to these case studies. I guess, why did you sort of settle on that narrative, or what makes that narrative so appealing as far as how the lessons to draw from history, as far as these companies sort of duking it out in a battle?
Because there's built-in drama, first of all. And secondly, you actually can, by seeing the conflict between the companies, you can see how marketing progresses. So, for example, let's take Coke and Pepsi. Coca-Cola was the brand beyond competition. I mean, I have some quotes in the book about, there's one American soldier in Burma during World War II saying, "I think I'm in this damn mess to help keep the custom of drinking Cokes." That's brand loyalty. I mean, if you're willing to take a bullet for a brand, that's brand loyalty. So Coca-Cola was the brand beyond competition. Well, how do you compete with the brand beyond competition? And Pepsi came up with a way of doing that. It had been bankrupt basically in the 1920s, but they came up in the 1930s with twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is a drink for you. The idea of twice as much for a nickel too during the Depression in the 1930s, when Coca-Cola was selling a 6.5-ounce hobble-skirted bottle for a nickel, you could sell a 12-ounce cola for a nickel. That had an enormous appeal. It was price appeal, and that's how they entered the market. Coca-Cola provided a price umbrella for them. So seeing this conflict to me made more sense than reading articles in the Harvard Business Review or the Journal of Marketing or you name it. I wanted it to be not a history of what academics had said about marketing, but a history of what business people did to market. And that conflict provided that drama. And also you got a sense of the progress of it.
For marketers and business leaders, is finding an enemy or finding your arch nemesis, is doing that proactively like a good part of strategy, or is that something that folks should kind of think about? Because it seems like there are categories that become almost duopolies, or where there's some iconic two companies duking it out. And then there are markets, at one time it was Coke and Pepsi, although I think the market is a little more fragmented now.
Yes.
Ford versus GM, same deal. It's probably more fragmented now, but at a time it was really two major brands duking it out and with kind of a duopoly dynamic. Is that as far as drawing the lessons of history, is that a thing that marketers and business leaders should proactively think about and strategize? Or how do you think about when something becomes a duopoly versus when it's more a fragmented space?
I think when it's a duopoly, in a sense, it's good because you're measuring yourself against a competitor that you understand. And in a sense, it's bad because you need to think out of the box. So you need to have radar spotting the next competitor that you need to measure yourself against. Companies that don't do that are companies that, I mean, Intel, was a great company in the 1990s. What the hell happened? Intel is a company which by 1999 had basically a monopoly on a device which was vital for life in the 21st century, which is the microprocessor. And they lost it. NVIDIA, which is now the headline company, was founded in 1993. How did they miss that? Especially when they had an Andy Grove, somebody who always said only the paranoid survive, a book which, by the way, was a bestseller. So it's important to have competitors, but it's important to have to focus on the smartest competitors that you can find. And that's what companies sometimes don't do.
So I want to also ask you about A&P, which is a company that a lot of listeners probably haven't heard of before, but they were at one time probably as well known as McDonald's. It's just a name that everybody would know. And could you share why you chose to focus on them, or what is the cautionary tale of A&P, or why feature them as a case study?
The first part of the book is basically from the manufacturer point of view. The second part of the book, Sears and the A&P, is from the retailer point of view. Sears marketed everything except food. A&P marketed food. And you need food, clothing, and shelter. I mean, these are what you need in order to make it through the day. A&P stocked America's pantries, and it was the power retailer of its time. And by the way, it managed a remarkable transition during the 1930s from 13,000 or 15,700 stores, I think it was, I could look it up, but thousands and thousands of stores that were small to a lot fewer stores that were large, because the automobile revolution made it possible for you to drive to a market rather than go to one streetcar and to stock up shop. They managed that transition very well. And the question was, having managed this enormous change so well, what went wrong that made it difficult for them to manage change in the future? So that's what that chapter is about. A&P was always looking for the next depression, and that made them, for example, sign one-year leases, and that meant they couldn't get the best store site locations. They were also deeply devoted to private label because they were vertically integrated. So when I was a kid, I'm 77 years old, many years ago, they would be selling Ann Page Sugar Frosted Flakes, A&P Sugar Frosted Flakes. Kellogg's was selling Tony the Tiger, which you're probably much too young to.
I remember, they're great. Yeah.
I mean, they're great. That's right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, okay, imagine that you're a mom and dad and you're shopping with your young kid because you don't have a babysitter, and the kid starts shouting, Tony the Tiger, Tony the Tiger. What are you going to say to them? You know what? You can get Ann Page Sugar Frosted Flakes. They're really built as good and they're 5 cents cheaper. The kid, has an acute psychotic episode. So you don't need to be screamed at much to say, you know what? I'm going to go to another supermarket and I'm going to get Tony the Tiger because that's what's coming into me over my television set, which was TV was very widely distributed by the 1950s in the United States. That was a revolution A&P did not manage well.
One way that I had heard of A&P prior to reading this book is have you seen the show Mad Men?
Yes.
Yes, I'm a big fan of the show. It's probably like also got me somewhat interested in this historical part of marketing. And I'm gonna give like some major spoilers. So if a listener is about to hear this, please skip ahead, 30 seconds or a minute or so. But AMP appears a few times in the show, and it was when I read this book and I was like thinking about this interview that I realized it always comes with a character dying, where like something actually really bad happening. A grandpa character, he dies, and where does he die? It's in line at AMP, and he's a guy that his generation would have shopped at AMP. There's a copywriter who sort of gets kicked out of the agency and sort of is down on his luck and doesn't really succeed, and he starts working at an AMP, and it's almost symbolizing kind of his character's death. And I think that's the last time you hear him reference his AMP. And then Betty, who's like the wife of the main character, she's seen in the last season shopping at an AMP, and like this is the biggest spoiler, is that she winds up, her end of the show is not good. And it just strikes me as this idea of using AMP almost as a metaphor in some ways of dying. With
Well, it didn't end well. I mean,
Yeah.
the story doesn't end well. The company was incapable of reinventing itself. Its owners, John and George Hartford, were like, very. I have a picture of them in the book. These are elderly men. They turned the company over to a man who might have been able to revive it, but he died of a heart attack early. Then it was in the hands of a man named Ralph Berger, who you'd think would be the perfect person in a food store. I mean, burger, but it didn't work. It didn't work out. There is actually in the book, if I can find it quickly, these stores had few customers, did little business, but were open long hours, often 7 days and weeknights. So people are trying, but they're not getting results. The end of this quote, which is from an AMP executive: cleanliness and courtesy standards, freshness and quality control standards, shelf stocking and checkout standards, and store morale all deteriorated at the same grinding, steady pace. So it happened step by step, and if it's the frog in the boiling water story. I mean, you know what I mean by that. Before you knew it, you had a boiled frog, and they couldn't compete. And their competitors, some of them are still very much in business. Safeway, Kroger, whatever.
Yeah, and also to kind of foreshadow, I think of AMP a lot of, I never have shopped at an AMP myself, but I kind of think of a lot of the same things as this Trader Joe's, kind of a counter reaction to the Krogers of the world, which seems to be, purely focused on food and doesn't really do advertising and promotion in the same way, doesn't have Tony the Tiger. It seems like there's this counter cycle. There's AMP that has sort of its own, private label foods. There's the supermarket that has the big brands. AMP dies, and then, well, something like Trader Joe's or these other, Whole Foods and other markets kind of come as almost counter reaction to that, to kind of fill in that gap that AMP left.
Here's a question for you. What did Jeff Bezos do? The first thing that he did when he bought Whole Foods? Do you know?
But I remember walking into a Whole Foods and then seeing Amazon Echoes at a display next to the bananas. I'm like, what the heck is going on here? But
He
I
cut
thought that's the first thing. He cut prices.
Cut prices on a lot of items.
Yeah.
So if you want to
That's
enter
right.
a market, price is all. There are two ways to
Yeah,
compete
that's right.
in this world. One is on the basis of price, and the second is on the basis of something else. That's it. He came in with price, but they're private label. So, well, they're not completely, but overwhelmingly, if you go kind of Stop and Shop or some up Safeway, they're overwhelmingly private label. So you can do it that way.
We're kind of going to more contemporary examples, and you published this book right at the dawn of the internet age. And in later writings, you talked about a fourth phase of hyper-segmentation.
Yes.
Can you share about this, or just share about other phases that might have happened after this book was published in the 1990s?
Well, certainly the internet, social media. I mean, companies now know so much about their customers that they're able to, what they say is, have markets of one. And the dream in the 1990s was to turn marketing into conversation rather than into buy this, buy this, buy this, rather than into a message from me as the purveyor and you as the customer. It was almost turn it into a conversation. And just the amount of data that big companies have about the people who are buying their product and about the people who might be buying their product, this is unprecedented. So any book on the history of marketing now would have to fully grasp what this fourth phase means. And that's not easy, but can be done. There's room for somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think those four phases have held up since you've introduced them, or how do you think about them today?
Historically, they've held up pretty well. In other words, as a description of what happened in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, it's a good pattern, but it's important to it's an idea. It's not just one story after another. But the important thing of introducing a pattern is that people can attack it. And they can do what I'm suggesting Coke and Pepsi did to one another. And in the clash of ideas, you grow. Intellectually, life is not a seesaw. I mean, if you come up with an idea like that and somebody else comes up with another idea, we're both better off. So that if it stimulates thought, and have been books written that have incorporated this, not just in marketing. There's a well-known book called The Economics of Strategy, which is not my field. David Bazanko is the lead author, and I once had a copy of it. I think it's through 8 editions, and they use Coke and Pepsi as an example of strategic approach to how do you attack an entrenched incumbent? That's not an easily answered question.
Yeah.
But incumbents also have dilemmas, which is how do you change when you're winning? That's also not a, these are questions that the study of history does surface. So this gets back to something that I said earlier, which is that history may not give you answers and history does not repeat itself, but it will give you questions. And then, you're the person with the corner office and the big salary, you come up with the answers.
This is something that I'm trying to figure out through this podcast as well, where I'm at this point, I'm just collecting interviews and hearing a wide variety of perspectives on different eras of history and of marketing. And I was surprised at how sort of contentious little parts of history are, or how it is something where it's not settled, and there's more debate than I was expecting over it. And something I'm wondering for you as a historian, I mean, your frameworks make perfect sense to me. It's like the overlap between a company's strategy, the transportation, the communications technologies, how consumers behave. It really does seem to sort of interact and fit these phases very well. But then you probably see a lot of, like, whataboutism, or like, "What about this thing? What about this little edge case that doesn't quite fit?" And how do you as a historian respond to that? Because 'Cause I'm sure, you can have the most elegant model, but it's a model. It's not the whole world, and the whole world is a little messy and doesn't always fit a little framework, and there's always gonna be a "what about this one" that doesn't quite fit. And how have you sort of addressed that over your career?
Well, that, by the way, is one of the great things of case method teaching, which is how the Harvard Business School is constructed, which is you can have a what about kind of corner case or edge case, if you will, as a case. And you can ask the students, is this the future or not? And let them see what they say. This is the difference between people who are successful and people who are not. I mean, you've got to keep a very open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. You've got to have uh, w- within your company, for example, a set of principles that do guide. So, for example, focus and simplify. I mean, that's a wonderful instruction which guides Apple. The importance of making decisions that guide the customer. Steve Jobs always said, I'm sure that your listener, I hope that your listeners know something about him because he's a remarkable figure in the history of marketing in addition to everything else. I mean, here's a guy who, was the entrepreneur of Apple Computer, was fired from his own company in 1985, came back to that company 12 years plus 1 day later in 1997, when the company was, depending upon whom you speak to, 6 weeks to 2 months away from bankruptcy and disappearance. And then he built it into, I haven't checked, I mean, the market's been crazy lately, but he built it into what was, until maybe just recently, the most valuable company in the world. Well, he made it possible for Tim Cook to turn it into the most valuable company in the world.
Yeah.
But among his instructions were, first of all, think different. So when you got there, you got a set of 9 photographs of people who thought different.
Yeah, yeah.
Pablo Picasso, Jim Henson, Martha Graham, the great dance entrepreneur. So you're taught that, but you also were taught the importance of defining for the customer what the customer really wanted. Steve Jobs believed that the customer, especially with a path-breaking product, did not know what he or she wanted. So it was up to you, not necessarily to ask, but to tell. So, for example, he always said, if Henry Ford had done market research, the market would have said, get a faster horse.
Right.
The market wouldn't have said, what I want is a, a Model T Ford, which in 1924 sold for half the price of a household refrigerator. The market wouldn't have come up with that.
Yeah.
And there is a wonderful book by a man named Ken Kosian, who was a software engineer at Apple during the great days of Steve Jobs. And there's an incident in that book. I think that's actually, although it's not a book about marketing, it's the best book on marketing I ever read. It 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 shows how Steve Jobs made decisions. The book's called Creative Selection, about, for example, in his case, the keyboard on the MacBook. It's an education, that book. It's a classic example of focus and simplify. Why is that so important? Because variety is expensive and complexity is hard to manage. So if you can focus and simplify, you're ahead of the game. And so there are a number of principles like that at Apple, but those don't necessarily tell you what the next step should be, but they tell you how to take that next step. And it's
Yeah.
wonderful for that reason.
Yeah. Well, I'm adding Creative Selection by Ken Kosian onto my reading list. That
Yeah.
sounds great. It's high praise.
I've never met the man. I lived out in Silicon Valley for 13 years. And if I had read that book earlier, I would have looked him up because he understands the soul of Apple, put it that way, which is not nothing.
One of the things this kind of brings up this idea of Jobs and Apple and Ford and the Model Ts. I think attention sort of in this book, maybe not attention, but an idea that kind of runs through this book and through some of your work more broadly is there are these systems and frameworks and eras of history, and there's models that give us order and understanding of markets, how they function, and predictability and trends. But then there's these entrepreneurs and these individual visions and people who break the mold and are outliers and are kind of unpredictable. And they themselves can shape markets in a way that a model or an era of history wouldn't predict. And I think even the book also cites this idea of Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, who talks about the role of the individual and the entrepreneur and sort of these bureaucratized environments in business and that. And I guess like how do you think about that as you tell these stories of telling the stories both of the systems and eras, but also of these individuals that break or reshape those systems? Like that seems like an idea that you've been kind of exploring through your work.
I'm very intrigued by, so for example, we started off by talking about Al Chandler. So if you take a look at strategy and structure and you look at the lists of companies he's got in that book, this was at the high tide of American business in 1962. Most of those companies are dead. What happened to them? Somehow bureaucratization makes it very, very hard to think about step function change. So take Amazon, for example. Here's a question for you. Why didn't Sears become Amazon? They had in 1980 and before then, Sears was the most trusted company in the country. They had a national network of warehouses. They have stores everywhere. Why, why didn't they have Sears web services? Why didn't Sears become Amazon? Because Jeff Bezos never would have gone to work for that bureaucratized a company. I mean, the guy had the soul of an entrepreneur. And also, I mean, that company lost money for a long time before it became the powerhouse that it is. He joked when he came to the Harvard Business School and gave a talk. He said, people are telling me I should have called it Amazon.org because it wasn't making any money. But he had an idea and understood how technology was going to revolutionize the nature of retail. And also the guy is really smart. You put all that together and, the result is Amazon. And Sears no longer exists. Kmart doesn't exist anymore. The page has been turned. And it is intriguing to me how difficult it is for an established company to reinvent itself when there is a step function change in the environment in which you are doing business. And for Bezos, that environment was technology. And Sears was just not able to reconceptualize the business that it had, given the new tools that were available. You needed somebody who was young, hungry, and smart to do that. Yeah, it's very, very hard for these companies to reinvent themselves.
It is, yeah. And sort of pulling on this thread of these individual case studies. So New and Improved is a survey of business history, kind of encompassing 100 years or more. And you wrote another book that was a survey of PR called Keeping the Corporate Image.
Yeah.
And then it seems like your work did shift more towards biographies of specific companies. You wrote a book on IBM. You mentioned Andy Grove, and you wrote a biography of him at Intel. And then you also wrote books about broader ideas like denial and charismatic business leadership. And it kind of seems like there's this historical survey of trends, and then you get way more specific talking about individuals. And in some ways, you kind of take another specific angle of a phenomena of denial and charismatic business leadership, almost little psychology studies.
Yeah.
And I guess why the shift from surveys and to these biographies? And I guess the role is, as far as a business historian and educator, is one more effective than the other, or do they both kind of have to coexist with each other?
I think they have to coexist. I think that a lasting biography is a biography that takes both the life and the times. So, you've got to put those together. And that's an exciting adventure. Also, the wonderful thing about biography is that in a certain sense, the biography sort of organizes itself. I mean, one thing comes after another as whoever the subject of the biography is grows. Somehow it's more, well, literally, it's more human. You get a sense of who the individual is who's making decisions, how this individual pursued his, and my people that I've written about are overwhelmingly men, but some women, or her career, what decisions they had to make. Andy Grove, for example, talks about something called the strategic inflection point. And that's the point at which either your company takes off into the stratosphere or it declines. And it is intriguing that you get to these nodes, these places where really, if you go right instead of left or whatever, I mean, there are turning points. You've got to make the right decision at those moments. It's very interesting, if you look at the history of Apple, to see, why did these people open stores in the early 2000s? Gateway Computer, which is a company you probably haven't heard. Well, you have heard.
Oh, I have. I mean, I'm not that young. But yeah, I remember visiting the Gateway store, out in the booties. Is maybe near like a Best Buy, but it'd be its own place. Yeah, it don't really exist so much anymore.
Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I'm sure you have a better answer than I do for these, but I would guess that it's not enough of a destination as far as like foot traffic, and Apple opened its stores in malls or actually really iconic places too, like their iconic store in New York City. They built these beautiful buildings that sort of welcome you in high traffic areas that are also usually probably relatively affluent areas. I think it's maybe a choice of place, and driving out to a Gateway seems like a antiquated idea.
Yeah, I mean, what Apple did was they reconceptualized the retail experience. It was, first of all, I mean, I think to this day, personally, I don't know how many stores they have, call it 500, maybe it's more. But when they opened those first stores, it was a place that you went to get educated about the product. And you're quite right. You didn't go out to the boondocks to shop at Apple. You went to a mall, and it would be right across, like, I mean, you name it, Victoria's Secret, whatever, or a Nike store, whatever. So it'd be very high traffic. And that, once again, that broke the mold, because these are consumer durables and they're expensive products. Apple has been a premium priced company that sells premium priced products that Steve Jobs thought needed a certain amount of explanation and of love. He reconceptualized what the retail experience could be for computers. And he did this after Gateway. My recollection is, maybe I'm wrong, closed its stores. They tried being their own retailer. They closed their stores. He opened his when the company was really very small. I mean, what a wild thing to do. By the way, the very introduction of the phone, which, may be the most important consumer product of the 21st century, which was, my recollection was in 2007. If you look at Steve Jobs's keynote that day, which I think is still online.
It's on YouTube. I've watched it more times than I can count. Yeah. It's
82, it was about 82 minutes long. And what there are a lot of fascinating things about it. First of all, he understands that it's an internet connectivity device. It's a phone, it's an iPod. Now, the iPod arguably is the product that made Apple. There's a beautiful book about this called The Perfect Thing. And the iPod was the perfect thing. And Jobs understood that if you could incorporate this into a phone, someone else is going to do it. Either we're going to do it or somebody else is going to do it. So he decides to do it. So it was an iPod, a phone, and an internet connectivity device, 3 in 1. But if you look at that keynote, he mentions the camera like in 1 minute. He says, by the way, it has a 2 megapixel rear facing camera. So now I don't know whether this is true, but my guess is that camera is one of the top 5 apps on the phone without knowing.
Yeah.
Now, how many photographs do you think are uploaded to the cloud every day? So what I'm trying to say is that Steve Jobs himself, and also the App Store, he didn't fully appreciate what he had there. But somehow it was open enough so that it could grow into this unbelievable product.
That's right. My guess is also that it's a level of focus, that storytelling is an editing process, and it's what you leave out. And that he kind of probably, as the great pitchman and marketer that he was, knew that if you included all the ideas and it was 4 things in one, or it was also a calculator and it was also these other things, well, it's almost too much for the brain to handle. And 3 is such an elegant number. There's this magic number, and it wouldn't. And even if you included the camera, which is probably my favorite app on the phone, I use that one a lot. I wouldn't remember it the same way if it was 4 in 1 versus 3 in 1.
No, I think there's some truth to that. That keynote was just a remarkable display of what he had and of the team that he had doing it. And people are yelling and screaming in the audience, and they're all Apple engineers. It was a joyous moment, and also it gave you a sense of how exciting it is to play on a winning team in business. And and that's really, he was able to construct that. That's part of the strength of the company. That Tim Cook was one of the great business executives in American business history. I mean, he took that ball and ran with it, and boy, did he. I mean, it's fantastic. Yeah.
We're talking about Apple, and you were a teacher at Apple University, and you also spent a big chunk of your career as a professor of business history at Harvard. And I'm wondering how those 2 experiences compare. Did and as you taught folks, did they immediately understand the benefits of learning business history, or did you really have to kind of paint the picture of, and this is why the business history matters to you today?
No, not
Yeah.
There was no need to sell it at Apple.
Yeah.
One of the biggest differences between the 2 experiences is that at Apple, you didn't have to grade papers. I would have 200 students a year, and that was 3 weeks of grading for the final. And of course, early in my career, you also had midterms, and that was hard. Also, at the Harvard Business School, there was a forced curve, so you had very smart students, but 10% of them, or depending on when we're talking about 10 to 15%, you had to give the lowest grade that you could to. That was hard. So you didn't have to deal with that, and you didn't have to sell history, because when I was at Apple, you weren't so much teaching history as you were teaching decision points. Since you knew how things turned out, you were able to set something up and say, okay, look, I can tell you that this decision resulted badly. What I want you to tell me is why. So here's the story. You tell me what went wrong and where it went wrong. That, by the way, you sort of learned that at the Harvard Business School. So one of the first cases that I taught in marketing there at HBS, Harvard Business School, was a salesman's diary. And it was, on September 12th, this happened. On October 5th, this happened. Whatever. And I'll never forget this case. The guy lost a sale. And all you had to do was to say to the students, all right, here are a list of dates. The guy kept a diary. Where did he lose the sale? And so, that happened. it's the past. But this is a dilemma that any person who's selling has to face. What went wrong and where did it go wrong? And it was cases like that you could teach anywhere, and it's a pleasure.
I want to also ask you about Substack and Dystopias and Demagogues.
Yes,
It's a Substack that I read, and the stakes feel higher compared to your other work.
they are.
And I read it. I recommend it. I wouldn't say I actually enjoy it, but I don't know if enjoy is the right word, because it's one where it gives me anxiety a bit, actually. And I think that's partly the point, that using historical examples to ring the alarm bells. Can you just tell me about Dystopias and Demagogues,
Yes.
and just your process with that?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I started writing this in August, and the reason that I started writing it was to explain to myself what was going on in the United States. I publish on Tuesdays at noon Eastern time each week. So I don't try to write something daily, as some people do, but that's not me. Um, I do want to use as a hook what's going on today, but I'm an historian, so I want to go back into history and say, well, what can we learn from what's happened in the past? So, for example, this country, and I never thought, if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said that this is something that's not going to happen. But this country seems to be turning its back on democracy. That's very, very dangerous. And history can tell you what has happened to countries who have made that choice, and what the symptoms are. And it can even perhaps suggest what the solutions to it might be. I'm more concerned. I'm 77 now, so I'm not going to be old, the machine runs down, the clock is ticking for me in a way that it's not for you. But when I look at the country now, I'm more concerned about its future than I've ever been in my life. Being an historian, I think the country is in fact in more trouble now than ever in its history, including the Great Secession Winter of 1860-61. I think that we're getting a lot of warnings that a lot of people are discontent. And so as a result, we have the president that we have now. It's not clear to me the extent to which he is a cause and the extent to which he is a symptom. And that's something that I try to work out. I also believe, it, among other things, the Dystopias and Demagogues has encouraged me to realize even more vividly than I have in my past the importance of history. George Orwell in 1984 said, "He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future." I actually believe that's true. I think that history has never been as important as it is right now, and it's distressing to me that so many universities are losing their focus on history, and because of because of the expense of going to these universities and because of the need to get some practical knowledge, which I understand and accept. Nevertheless, studying history helps you tease out the difference between fact and fiction. I'll give you one classic example, and that's what happened in Germany in the years from 1919 to 1933. These are the years of what was known as the Weimar Republic, because it was originally the first meeting of the new government was in the city of Weimar. One of the things that made life difficult if you're a statesman in the Weimar Republic was the stab in the back belief. In other words, the belief that Germany had not actually lost World War I, but that it had been betrayed by leftists, by social democrats, especially communists, and by Jews. The result of that myth was the fact that, well, in part, this is a long story, but in part was the fact that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. The result of that was 12 years of hell between 1933 and 1945. And a lot of that was because of a belief in history that was in fact quite mistaken. Germany lost that war, World War I, on the battlefield. They were going to be, there were revolts against further fighting in the Kiel naval base, for example. There was a revolution in Germany. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, was kicked out of the country. Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary and Turkey, had already given up. I mean, the war was going to end. But because of the misunderstanding of what actually happened, a lot of horrible things took place. So I think that an acute and honest understanding of the past is actually very important in moving forward. So that's what Dystopias and Demagogues is about. And I agree. I mean, if you look at New and Improved, I mean, this is a book that there are a lot of laughs in this book. And back when I developed talks out of it, and Coke and Pepsi could not miss because you would show ads. Pepsi Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much for an L2. Pepsi Cola's a drink for you. And to see Pepsi move from that, which is a pure price appeal, to Come Alive, You're in the Pepsi Generation, sung by Joni Summers, it was a different world. But it's fun. The cola wars are fun. The situation this country is in right now is not quite as enjoyable. So, but I think it's important to face facts. And that's what I try to do in Dystopias and Demagogues. And it's also, by the way, it's a way of keeping in touch with former students, of which I have thousands. I love hearing from them and taking their advice, learning from lead users, which is very important. Anyway, that's the story.
I think the current situation obviously evokes a lot of feelings, and sometimes people don't know what to do with them. Like, I think that's part of it, is like, what action do you take? And I'm just glad that you've found this productive outlet for it, where you weekly write these really thoughtful historical essays that are well researched and always provide something interesting. And it's an example of something you can do that's productive, instead of just, I don't know, venting on social media or about it or whatever other people do. It just seems like a really productive use of the situation. So I'm grateful for you for writing that and for doing that. I think that's an inspiration. I publish this on Substack also weekly, and I think just having a weekly practice of anything is something I've personally enjoyed over the last few months of doing this too. So it's
great. No, it organizes your life in a very positive way, I think.
Yeah. So aside from subscribing to Dystopias and Demagogues, are there any other places you direct listeners who want to learn more about you and your work and find your work online?
I don't think so. I mean, I've got plenty of books through Amazon. Giants of Enterprise was a book I enjoyed writing very much. It was a number of years ago. But it is fun to re-engage with business executives, a man like Sam Walton, a woman like Oprah Winfrey. These are, or Mary Kay Ash. These are remarkable stories. And there are a lot of them are think different stories. And so it was fun to research them and write about them. And as I say, that's online. If anyone's interested, you can take a look at, go to Apple Books or Kindle, what have you.
Great. Well, Richard Tedlow, thanks so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate all of your work too, and reading your work. And I look forward to reading more of your books down the line too. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
A History of Marketing is written and produced by me, Andrew Mittrak. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blog posts about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. If you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app, or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.